break. Thank you.
Yeah.
So now we welcome Professor Sven Wunder. It's very interesting to have you here today because we have discussed land use conversion and effects on biodiversity, but we have discussed so far agricultural landscapes, mostly because we don't have more or less forests left in Europe. But indeed, you are specialized in forest and effects on biodiversity. So you have an interesting profile again because you both have expertise in economics, but also in forestry. From University of Copenhagen. And then you are the principal scientist at the European Forest Institute, Mediterranean Office in Barcelona, and you are a senior associate with the Center of International Forestry Research, the CIFOR. So your work focuses primarily on payments for environmental services, deforestation, and the REDD+ strategy. So we are really happy to have you today to complement our expertise. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline, for this nice presentation and introduction, and obviously also for the invitation to come here. I noted from the previous speakers that it's really important to handhold this microphone in a very in the right position. It has to be sort of the Goldilocks position, not too tight and not too far away. So it's a bit like, is it okay? More? Closer? Louder? Okay. So it's a bit like performing a karaoke, I think. And maybe in terms of speaker sequence, you will go from Spider-Man to Stevie Wonder. But exactly, I don't know. But anyhow, so what will my song be for the next 40 minutes? It will be about REDD+. I don't know if that sounds exciting, but it's reduced emission from deforestation and forest degradation. And the plus is all the other things that the UN body has added to that mechanism, namely conservation and sustainable forest management and forest enhancement, and what else you can sort of think of in terms of biomass enhancement and carbon capture of forests. And how will I go about this, the relationship between those two? Well, first I will look at to what extent does this REDD+ initiative, sort of the conservation for carbon initiatives, effectively succeed in increasing forest biomass? Does it actually work? The second is then, to the extent that it works, do these forest cover effects also translate into biodiversity co-benefits? And the third will be a discussion and some of the policy implications. So we clearly into the sort of remedies and where in the morning we had a lot about diagnosis about the problems. And it also links closely to what Patrick has been presenting before lunch. Okay, starting with the first question. To what extent has REDD actually been working in the way that it has been foreseen? And we can see REDD is something about, whether we can keep the trees standing by using money, right? If you express it shortly, it's sort of a kind of payments for environmental services initiative between countries, where the rich countries are paying the forested, a bit poorer countries to reduce their impact on greenhouse gas emission through forests, and do so in a conditional way. We can say REDD+ as such is an objective, which you can achieve in different ways, but the way the model of REDD+ has been conceived up to the Bali conference in 2007, where it was launched, the UNF CCC, has been sort of as this model of conditional payments. And I actually need my glasses. We can say that REDD Plus is a sort of an umbrella strategies for many different things, which includes both incentives and disincentives vis-à-vis landowners and users. There are different scales of it. There are jurisdictional scales, and there have been a lot of pilot projects since 2007. And some of them we call REDD, by design. They carry that particular label, but we also have experience of national policies reducing deforestation strongly, such as in Brazil after 2005, which were not launched as part of under the REDD label, but still have a lot of important elements that they share with REDD+. And I think arguably we in the international community and among the donors, etc., we're not patient enough with actually seeing things through, trying them out. And many people are already starting to write off this thing and move to the next big thing out there, where I think we should give it a better chance. Because fact is so far that the financing of REDD+, it has remained rather small. We can see here the different donor countries, and you can see a very high concentration. Obviously, Norway with its NICFI initiative stands out as really an outlier. The US and Germany have also given important funding, but it's quite concentrated, and the volumes are actually not very big. So, if we look a bit at how much forest is being affected by these areas in the tropics, this is kind of a map where we looked at the density, in particular of the 347 subnational initiatives which we could count in 2014. And you can see there are some sort of hotspot countries like in the Andes region, Madagascar, a bit in East Africa, Indonesia, etc. But others in Brazil and other places in Africa are also important. What have these initiatives so far achieved on the ground? We looked at it in an article published last year in COSOST, and the surprising finding is that there are only 12 studies that looked at forest carbon and land use outcomes. There's a lot more studies that look at other things like welfare impacts and land tenure and maybe decentralization and other sort of human-related things, which is more of interest to many people, and I think it's an important lesson that maybe we're not paying not enough attention to the basic impacts on carbon and on land use. So among those 12 studies, it's a very small sample, obviously, but we do find some positive impacts, but also a large range, as you would expect for pilot projects in general. And as a side remark, in terms of the welfare impacts, those are often quite small or insignificant. So REDD+ tends to be, lightly improve livelihoods or being neutral, but it doesn't really sort of lift off incomes either. Just to show you one example of a subnational project. This is a Trans-Amazon project by the NGO UCLouvain, being carried out in Pará state in Brazil. And it's this assessment here, it's, does this one work? well, you can see the upper line is showing you quite an area with quite heavy deforestation between 2008 and 2014. The lower, less bold line is showing you some control areas that were chosen. And from a sort of difference in difference type of comparison, simple comparison, you can see that there is with the project being implemented in 2010, particularly with payments to landowners to deforest less, and also other technological assistance type of measures, they managed to halve deforestation actually for those people. So forests still went down, but not at the same high speed. So you have an additionality as a distance between those two curves. And what we really have been lacking is some studies of the national initiatives. This is actually, this Rupsind paper, it's not published yet, but I happen to be a reviewer of it for PNAS, and now it's accepted, so I allowed myself to show it here. It's on the Norwegian-financed initiative with Guyana from 2010 to 2015. Where they paid them for deforestation to stay under a certain level. So this is a high forest, low deforestation type of country. And for those, there was a prediction that deforestation would pick up quite strongly. And you can see here that in the 2010 to 15 period, there is actually a substantial difference in the sense that deforestation did not pick up as strongly as in the other countries. But if you only looked at Guyana, that would be hard to see because you have still an accelerating trend of deforestation. What they did here to create a control, which is always hard with countries, they created like what you call synthetic control. So you take like statistically collect bits and pieces of other countries that are comparable and weight them in, and you create a synthetic Guyana for comparison. What you also can see here is that once the program stopped, actually deforestation picked up quite strongly again. So no permanence from these things, that you get a bonus after these things stop. You should not expect that these kind of payments necessarily will last longer than in their effects than the program itself. Now we could also say among all those different conservation tools that we have, how effective are they actually in stopping deforestation, even though they don't call themselves REDD. So this is a synthesis study we did recently, looking at effect sizes on deforestation of different types of measures. Incentives, disincentives, and sort of enabling policies, for instance, land tenure reform and other things that you can do. And as you can see, incentives are actually doing pretty well compared to the disincentives of protected areas and forest laws and forest enforcement, etc. But there's a wide spread among all of these things. There's not a clear pattern that one is better than the other. And I'm going to move a bit to CFOR's global comparative study on REDD Plus that I'm participating in. It's a larger comparative study in 6 countries with 23 sites and more than 4,000 households, where the idea was to come in and just before or when a program of REDD Plus is about to start, select some control areas and then look at it before and after. That's sort of the classical before-after control intervention methodology. So some surveys were done here, but a lot of, we have 2 surveys round, and the third one was done in 2018 for selected sites. So it involves land use mapping and socioeconomic questionnaires, etc. What do the results look like for land use? We find some quite tiny effects, actually, only at this stage. And this also has to do with the fact a lot of these projects have not received the financing they were waiting for. So there are placeholders that exist on the website, and they have also been doing some pilot actions, etc., but not at all the scale of actions that were foreseen. We can find better performance if we include the controls. It's important to look at the proper controls, and we also find better performance if we look at it at village levels than at the larger regional levels, and that is because precisely the treatment intensity has been so uneven that they have worked quite a lot in some villages, and there you can see an effect, but in others where they have not, obviously you can't. So, not particularly encouraging, but let me move to the second part of my talk here, which is about to what extent any forest cover effects from REDD+ that we could depict would also translate into biodiversity co-benefits. So this is obviously something about, to start with, about the global congruence between, forest biomass carbon and on the one hand, and biodiversity on the other hand. So it's the habitat effect, etc., of conserving more forests. Does that translate into more into biodiversity gains? And this is probably this study by Bernardo Strasbourg and colleagues from 2010. It's probably the study that has been most well known in this area, most cited, looking at it really at the global scale and mapping forest biomass in comparison to total species, threatened species, and restricted range species. And it finds, a quite close correlation between those, especially for total species and less for the two other measures. So it concludes that there are potentially high synergies at this very core scale. So, the cells are actually each neighboring cells has a distance of 1,400 kilometers. So it's pretty coarse compared to, and we've discussed scale various times here during the morning and how important it is. So therefore, it's important to scale the whole thing down a little bit, right? This is still a large scale. This is the Brazilian Amazon, and I'm looking here at just a map of the forest carbon density, which is highest in the central and northern parts, which are the sort of the wettest part, and whereas is in the southern part, which is sort of the transition zone to the cerrado, savanna type of areas, you have less forest mass and forest biomass naturally, and you also have the arc of deforestation where a lot of these things have been cleared. And if you look at biodiversity, you can see it was already commented in the morning that actually the Cerrado is quite an important area for biodiversity, and among the forest areas more to the north, it's some of the border areas, like in Acre, for instance, in the west, and Rondônia in the north, that are most important for biodiversity. Although these will also vary a bit according to which indicators you are using. But you should also look at where are the threats projected to be, because doing an intervention in a place that would be conserved anyhow because it's too remote for any kind of economic activity to happen does not produce an additional effect, right? no matter how good the synergy between carbon and biodiversity is. So here we mapped, this is actually from Britaldo Soares Filho's assessment, his Nature paper on mapping the threats, and it very much follows infrastructure, some previous road building, etc., planned roads, paved roads, etc. You can predict where the pressures would be coming. And the other part of it is obviously costs. You should also think about, well, at least if you have a voluntary conservation measure like payments for environmental services or maybe certification, etc., you should look at, what are the opportunity costs of those actors that you need to compensate then to enroll in your program. And in this case, we were looking at, trying to compute and simulate the opportunity costs in different municipalities and see at the current carbon price, what would be the areas that could be bought out, what could be the deforestation we can buy out, and what deforestation is just so profitable because it's soybean or it's because it's high value timbers or some perennials, etc., that are really high value that you actually can't pay for it, right? And this gives you a pattern. The green areas are the ones you could buy out. The red ones are the ones that are happen to be too expensive because of more profitable land uses, or because there's not so much forest biomass left. Actually, that matters. So ideally, you would want sort of some methodology, as we try to do here, for combining the different environmental services, carbon and biodiversity being two of them. You combine it with the threat level and with the provision costs that you would face for each of your plots. And by that, you can make a rational choice, in principle, about which are the best areas to enroll into your program. So I'm scaling down a little bit more to a smaller country, which is Costa Rica, famous for its payments for environmental service program, and but also a country where deforestation has already leveled off and forest transition has begun to set in. And we're also here trying to map the spatial correlation between different environmental service values. I think Klaus showed some sort of similar trade-off matrix for more services, but we can see here actually the carbon and biodiversity, sort of the peak areas of delivery, they're actually negatively correlated. And that is because a lot of the carbon biomass is on the Caribbean coast, in lowland areas, which are not so important for biodiversity. The biodiversity areas are more in sort of higher up areas, and so these things can matter quite a lot once you are down to scales that are more close to management decisions. Also, this study from Jonah Bush and colleagues back from 2010. It's sort of a backward-looking simulation where they were trying to look at deforestation between 1990 and 2005, and then defined a potential commitment period from 2005 and 10, and what would be if there had been money enough to buy all deforestation out that would have been determined by the reference period from 1990 to 2005. And what would that have meant in terms of forest area, but also in terms of extinction, of species extinction? And the message is, on the one hand, that if you really can buy out, if you have money enough to buy out the whole thing, it could matter quite a lot. But the other message is that it's quite different for where you apply your money. The bang for the buck will be much higher in some of those areas where you really have a high pressure on biodiversity hotspots, such as Ecuador, Indonesia, Madagascar, etc., and much lower for some of countries like Gabon or India and China, which have a more static forest picture as well. Now, we flagged Indonesia in this figure, and this is a study we did also as part of CIFOR's global comparative study on REDD, where we looked closer at Indonesia and where REDD Plus projects were located, where the forest threats are being projected, and sort of comparing, again, sort of overlaying the maps between carbon and different measures of biodiversity. And what we can see is actually was a bit surprising in the sense that the Indonesian REDD Plus projects, they are not located in the most carbon-dense areas. They are actually more in the more species-rich areas, the more biodiversity-important areas. And why is that? That's because it's many of them are run by NGOs, etc., that were already active before in biodiversity conservation, and they've seen REDD Plus as a new source of revenues, so they've sort of rebranded their old projects into REDD projects to get money to continue the work that they are doing. About 25% of the forest protected by REDD by these Indonesian projects were in threatened areas. That's may not sound so high, but it's actually much better than the protected areas, which tend to be sort of the far and high areas that are not really threatened and not really being pressurized by economic development yet. So they're actually doing well in that sense. But we also would see the results depend quite a lot on which species diversity indicator you are choosing, again with the same three as before. So the conclusion from the study is that in Indonesia at least, first generation REDD Plus projects are located where they are likely to deliver biodiversity benefits. So a positive conclusion. Question is there also how much carbon they're actually saving. So, all right. So after all these numbers and synthesizing studies, a bit about possible policy implication. I mean, what we can find is that there are clearly some synergies between carbon and forest carbon and forest biodiversity at the global scale, but at the finer scale there may be some trade-offs. And obviously that shouldn't be a surprise, since a forest house like 2/3 of all known species. And there are hence some strong sort of intrinsic synergies between the two. It's kind of a no-brainer. But if the budgets are tight, if you can't protect all the forest areas, which is typically the case, and you have to focus in on a finer scale, then there will be some trade-offs. Because the local hotspots do not, of different environmental services, do not coincide perfectly. And there may also be a potential for leakage, that some of those economic pressures you are impeding move to other areas with lower biomass density, but higher, but still important for biodiversity. Again, the Cerrado is a prime example. What about REDD Plus in general? I'm seeing it a little bit like so far unfulfilled promises that are packaged in Chinese boxes. And the first box is obviously that the whole thing has remained underfinanced, especially at the national level. There have been quite a lot of pilot projects, etc. But originally the whole thing was targeted to tropical forest countries, and there has been some readiness financing, etc. So the next box, if we were able to deal with that, is well, the intervention we've seen. They are quite tentative. There's not a clear model of what you should do. There's a quite heterogeneous mix of interventions, and often they resemble a bit the integrated conservation and development projects of the past, which are also another umbrella term for combining different measures, redirecting development towards sort of more benign forest uses, which are not necessarily often the best way of going about things if we look at the experiences with these projects. So maybe there's not enough willingness yet to also really experiment with new models. The third box would be one that relates to us as researchers and the donors that are financing our research, in the sense that we haven't really been looking at, even for those experiences we've not really been looking at the impacts on carbon and on land use. People tend to be much more interested in equity questions and land tenure and all of these anthropogenic outcomes. And I would even say that to a certain extent, those communities have been hitching a ride on REDD+ to sort of get money for some of the things that they are interested in and research those. And then where these things have been evaluated, the conservation results, there are encouraging things, there are more disappointing things, but you would need more experiences to actually be able to say something more solid about, what's the way you should structure a REDD+ program in different contexts. So in terms of strategies of how to sort of combine these concerns about REDD+ and biodiversity, it obviously depends on the funding you have available. The more money you have to throw at the two problems, the less you have to think about, the more forest you can enroll, and the less you need to think about any trade-offs. But it also depends on the sort of the congruence scenarios that have been showing above. Typically, if you have one scenario where you could bundle carbon and biodiversity to sell to the same single buyer, and the Global Environment Facility is a prime example of a mechanism where explicitly those two services are being financed jointly. Another one would be sort of a layering strategy, where you are selling a group of services to different buyers. So the example here is the Noel Kempf project in Bolivia, which was being there was investments from electricity companies, etc., on the carbon side, but at the same time also the biodiversity NGOs from the US invested in this project. They sort of came together to jointly finance these activities. And the third one is obviously one where it's only one service that is being paid for, and the other one is free riding to an extent. I think various of the conservation NGOs that go into carbon, etc., try to go into carbon markets, do so also to get some biodiversity benefits out of it. And as I was showing for the Indonesian case. And where does that leave us in terms of killing the two birds, carbon and biodiversity, with a single stone? I mean, you often hear statements like this one: REDD Plus must stop deforestation and maximize co-benefits for the poor and for biodiversity. But Jan Tinbergen, an economist, was famous in macroeconomics. He said back in the 1950s, policymakers must have at least as many independent policy instruments as policy targets. And he was thinking about employment and inflation in particular. But we could also think about carbon and biodiversity, or biodiversity and poverty, etc. And the point is that if you have finite budgets, which you usually have, then you actually cannot maximize more than one target, logically speaking, with one single tool. So if you only have REDD Plus available, your options will be limited. Of course, there is more to it, relaxing some of my initial assumptions. Of course, biodiversity is also important as a precondition for maintaining carbon stocks, because it's important for forest health, at least at some level. I think you can manipulate forest quite a lot and reduce biodiversity without health being completely destroyed. But it's an important feedback factor to think about. And also, it's not only the habitat effect that is important, but also to the extent that REDD Plus is actually effective in mitigating climate change, and you get less climate change, you would also get a climate effect you would mitigate a climate effect on species extinction. It's a small one, but still important to keep in mind, because the land-based solutions may, these figures are always disputed, but typically between 20 and 30% of the mitigation potential is being attributed to the land-based sectors. So I think the whole co-benefit story, it's clearly important, but I think we are in trade-off territory. It's typically something that you have to maximize one thing under the constraints of several other things you also want to have positive effects on. And you can't, as was said in the morning, you can't expect to maximize outcomes for all the SDGs at the same time. And my personal view is maybe it's better to first make the REDD Plus as a model really work in its own right in terms of achieving the greenhouse gas emission mitigation, rather than very early on trying to force an overload of objective functions, trying to do too much in too short time in terms of getting biodiversity into the project design of these interventions. I'll stop with that. Thank you.